My name is Sajah Popham, and I live down in Southern Oregon, outside of Ashland, with my wife Whitney out there, and spend my time out there doing a lot of teaching and seeing clients and making spagyric medicines. I've got a booth in there in the main hall there, so if any of you all want to come over and taste some spagyrics or check out some herbs, feel free to come on by and say hi, get to know me a little bit. I'd like to get to know you a little bit too. So the topic of this morning's discussion is the key to herbal energetics and the human constitution. That last piece kind of got cut out of the description there. So the key to herbal energetics and the human constitution. And this is a really, really important area of herbal medicine that I believe is a critical facet to a true holistic practice of plant medicine. And this is probably the number one overlooked thing by a lot of herbalists these days. And so I'm really passionate about talking about this because herbal energetics and constitutional theory really forms the crux of all traditional systems of medicine, whether we're talking about Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Tibetan medicine, the Unani Tib system from the Arabias, Greek medicine, even traditional North American herbalism, the physiomedicalists, the eclectics. All of these systems had an understanding of herbal energetics and an understanding of human constitution. And so what I'd like to share with you today is what I see as being the underlying principles behind herbal energetics and behind constitutional theory, because they're one and the same thing. And whether we're talking about Eastern systems of medicine, Western systems of medicine, ancient, modern, they were all really built off of a same understanding of nature, right? A vision and understanding of the underlying energetics of life. And I think this is a very important aspect that a lot more herbalists are becoming more aware of, that I think is very good and very important. And this is really what can make the difference between the herbs that you give someone either working or not working, right? Or potentially making someone worse, right? We tend to think like, oh, herbs, they're just good for everyone, and but we can actually use herbs allopathically in the same way that drugs are used allopathically. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? And there's this kind of, I think there's this really common myth, like maybe not here, but kind of out there in the culture, right? The standard culture, that myth sounds a little something like this. I use herbs, therefore I'm holistic. Sound familiar? Right? It's a really common way of thinking, right? Like you ask someone on the street, right? Some random person on the street, well, what's holistic medicine? What is holistic medicine, right? And they say, oh, that's like vitamins and herbs and homeopathy or something, right? You know what I'm talking about? And it's kind of this mindset that holism means what kind of medicine you give someone. And it's really not true. That true holistic medicine, true holistic healing isn't what you give, it's how you give it. Right? It's not what you give, it's how you give it. And it's a certain perspective, it's a certain way, it's a mode of perception. And it's a really central thing that I like to talk about, because we are all kind of born into and raised in a very allopathic paradigm, right? In a use this for that paradigm, right? And you see it in herbalism all the time, right? If I say the word inflammation, what's the one herb that comes to y'all's mind? Turmeric, right? Notice everyone that said something said turmeric, right? And what's the energetics of turmeric? What's turmeric taste like? It's pretty pungent, right? It's also kind of astringent and drying, right? So if you got someone that's really hot and fiery and energetic, kind of like a person like me, right? And they got some inflammation, do you think turmeric's a very good herb for them? No. And it actually might make them worse. because it's contraindicated for their constitution. And the only way we understand how a plant works on the constitution is through the energetics. And so these two things, the human side, the plant side, energetics and constitution, critical understanding. So I'd like to share with you a little bit about kind of my perspective, my understanding of herbal energetics and constitutional theory, and kind of the underlying forces behind that, so you can kind of start to bring it together. And whether we're talking about Chinese constitutional theory, Ayurvedic constitutional theory, the four humors of Greek medicine, the 6 tissue states of the physiomedicalist, whatever we're looking at, these are the underlying patterns that are influencing all of those systems. So when you have that key, you can kind of start to translate between the systems, right? Because they were all built off of following the light of nature. Right? They all saw the vital force, right? The principles of life and how they manifest in people and plants, right? So this is to me, energetics and constitution is like the foundation of holistic herbalism. And if you're here, you probably don't want to be an allopathic herbalist, right? Who here wants to be an allopathic herbalist? Okay, excellent. You're in the right place. Right? So, and this is a mindset thing, right? Like I didn't even realize, because I had that way of thinking too, right? I was like, oh, I'm an herbalist, so I'm holistic, right? And I didn't realize, like, oh, wait a minute. Allopathy and holism it's a perspective, it's an approach, right? So I'd like to maybe get clear on some definitions here, right? In terms of like, what is constitution? Like, what does that mean? And what is herbal energetics, right? And that way when I say those words, we're kind of on an even keel, right? We have a mutual understanding, okay? So the constitution, what do you all think of when you hear the word constitution or constitutional theory or constitutional systems? What kind of things come to mind? Yeah. Hot, cold, wet, dry? Yeah, absolutely. Very important. Yep. Anything else?
Body type.
Body type. Yep. Absolutely. Critical piece. Anybody else? The doshas of Ayurveda. Yes. The 4 temperaments. Yep.
5 phases in Chinese medicine.
5 phases of Chinese medicine. Yep, absolutely. So I think of the word constitution, like I'm a word geek, right? I really like etymology. I think we can understand a lot if we just kind of go back to the roots of words, right? And if we look at, like, what's another word that's similar to the word constitution? Say again? Type. Constituent. All right, you think of constituent. So when you think of like a constituent in a plant, what is that? It's like a piece of the whole. It's a part of the whole. So I think of constituents as like what constitutes a being, right? What are the underlying forces that determine someone's state of being? And so when we're looking at constitutional systems, we're looking at what are the underlying forces that influence the form. What are the underlying forces that influence the form? And, you know, force and form, they're kind of two sides of a spectrum of life, right? Everything has force and form. Another term we can use for that would be yin and yang, right? Force and form. And what I love about constitutional systems is that it allows you to see what's behind the physiology, what's behind the psychology, what's behind the organism, right? And so when we have put our constitutional goggles on, right? We're able to see a little bit deeper into what's influencing that person's life, right? What are the forces that influence the form? Does that make sense? Right? So, because this is important because, you know, you can have 3 different people and they all have, say, constipation, right? And from an allopathic model, they say, oh, you have constipation, here, take some fiber or maybe an allopathic herbal perspective, right? Go to the natural food store or whatever, and they say, here, drink this smooth move tea or something, right? And some stimulant laxatives to help get the bowels moving, right? And sure, it maybe works. Sure, it might take the symptom away, right? But is that really holistic? No, right? From a holistic perspective, what do we ask? Why is this person constipated, right? What's the force behind the form? What's the reason that there's that constipation there? And so, as you mentioned, hot, cold, wet, dry, right? A critical facet that we can have, different people can have the same symptom for different underlying reasons. One person might have that constipation because they've got a lot of tension. They're really tense and they're really nervous and everything's kind of constricted in the bowels, and so things aren't able to move. Maybe another person's really dry, right? And everything's all dried out and there isn't that lubrication that allows things to move through the system. Another person might be really cold and damp, right? And they've got a lot of stagnation and accumulation, right? Things just are kind of stuck in there, right? 3 very different types of constipation, right? Y'all see that, right? We're going to treat that very differently, right? Is marshmallow root going to be a very good herb for the person with the cold, damp kind of constipation? No, guess what? Might make it worse, right? So this is critical because we don't want to treat the symptom. We want to treat the underlying cause in the constitution. And when I say the constitution, I'm not just saying the constitution of the whole person. I'm saying the constitution of the specific organ, right? And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. Right, so, the marshmallow is going to be really great for the person with more of that dried out tissue, right? The constitution of the large intestine is dry, right? And we want to bring that moisture in, right? For the really tense person, we might want to give like an antispasmodic, right? Something that's going to dilate and open and relax, something like wild yam, right? It's a wonderful antispasmodic specific for the digestive system. For the person that's really damp and stagnant in there, right, we might want to give some warming pungent remedies, right, like a warming carminative, right, in order to bring more blood flow and circulation and kind of stimulate and get things moving a little bit more, right? So 3 totally different herbs there, right? We got an antispasmodic, we got a demulcent, and we got like a warming carminative. And if you give that herb to the wrong kind of constipation, it could potentially exacerbate the problem or at least not work, right? So this is really important because a lot of people are like, geez, I heard that this herb is good for that, right? Notice the language, that this herb is good for that. That translates to allopathic thinking, right? And it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Why didn't it work? Why didn't they get better? It's like because that herb was likely contraindicated or not, or at least not matching to the imbalance within the organ system. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about constitutions a little bit later. What about energetics? What kind of words or phrases come to mind for y'all when I say the word energetics? What do you think of? Personality. Let's think specifically to the herbs. Temperature, yeah. What else comes to mind? Think herbal energetics. Taste, yeah, critical. Taste and energetics, very intimately connected. That's why I always encourage people to put your medicine where your mouth is. Right? Or as Matthew Wood says, not to be an armchair herbalist, right? I love that term, armchair herbalist, right? We just sit in our armchair and read all day, right? It's an intellectual way of knowing, but we don't want just an intellectual way of understanding our plants. We don't want knowledge, we want understanding. And the only way we come to a place of understanding is through experiential learning. And that's where knowledge and information comes from our head and moves down into our heart where it turns into wisdom, right? Because we have an experience. And it's through the taste that we actually begin to experience our medicines, right? When you taste the bitterness of Oregon grapefruit, all of a sudden you know that herb on a total other level than just reading Oregon grape is bitter, right? And you feel the drying effects of it over the long term, and you feel the way it moves your liver and moves your digestion, right? You feel that cooling effect that it has. It's like, whoa, I may not want to give that to the cold person, right? Any other thoughts come to mind when I say the word herbal energetics?
Habitat.
What was that?
Habitat.
Habitat, yeah, a critical piece of looking at the energetics of a plant. I saw a hand back there.
Yeah, like where does it move? If I drink it, does it make me, do I get flushed? Or do I feel like I need to pee? Like, where does the energy move?
Where does it move? Yeah, did you all hear that? So how does that plant move the vital force of the body? And we can look at a very general, does it move up and out? Does it move down and in? Right? So like she said, does my face get flushed? Does it kind of move the energy up? Right? Or does it kind of sink it down and in? Maybe draining things out. Right? I think I saw your hand.
Body system affiliation.
A system affinities, yeah, system affinities. So where in the body does that plant go? What type of affinities does it have? Or an older term for that would be appropriation, right? Organ appropriation. These are all critical aspects. Like, excellent. I'm loving these answers because I ask this question a lot when I talk about energetics. And the types of words that I oftentimes hear are kind of like, oh, the energy of a plant, it's like the spirit of the plant, or it's kind of what's in the astral world, or ninth dimensional beings, right? Kind of like way out there kind of stuff. And so this is great. I'm really liking the answers that I'm hearing because what you're all talking about is a very grounded understanding of energetics, right? Which is very, very important. So energy. Right, the energy. What's the energy of the plant? And in Ayurveda, they call it virya. Virya. Did everybody get the iPad there?
It's not working.
Oh, it's not working? Oh, we'll just open up. Oh, it must have. We'll take it to the booth later. And
Okay.
Sorry, glitch.
Okay.
Been having technological issues this week, and Mercury's not retrograde. At least I don't think it is.
Form and structure with energetics too.
Of the plant.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can learn a lot about the energetics of a plant by the shape, the morphology, the habitat, where it grows. Yeah, these are all things that inform us, taste, etc. So when we're talking about energetics, we're looking at how does that plant influence the state of the tissues, right? The state of the tissues. When we're looking at something like herbal actions, diaphoretic, diuretic, expectorant, things like that, we're looking at how does that plant shift or adjust the physiology of the body. When we're looking at energetics, we're looking at how does that plant shift the specific composition of the tissues, specifically from the perspective of, as you said earlier, hot, cold, wet, dry. But there's actually 3 other patterns of energetics that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, right? So right, you go to your herb, and this is why herbal energetics is important. Someone has a cough, right? Someone has a cough. So what type of herbal action do we typically think of for a cough? Expectorants, right? Expectorants. So you go to your herb book, and you say, okay, this person needs an expectorant. So you look up the expectorants, and what do you usually get, right? Big list. Right, big list of herbs that are all expectorants. And on that list, we might see remedies like elecampane and osha and lamation, plantain, licorice, marshmallow, coltsfoot, wild cherry bark, mullein, right, lobelia, pleurisy root. All of those herbs I just said, all wonderful expectorants, right? But can we really put marshmallow root next to osha? Right, sure, they're both expectorants, very different medicines, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Right, so does knowing herbal actions alone give you the tools and the information that you need to effectively administer remedies to people, yes or no? No, it doesn't, right? And you ever notice that, at least from my library, right, there tends to be a big focus on actions, at least in Western herbalism. Right? Big focus on herbal actions. It's important, don't get me wrong. Actions are really important, but it's when you couple actions with energetics that all of a sudden you get much more specific. And so for me, when I'm classifying plants, kind of in my mind or on paper or whatever, right? I'm always taking the actions and then dividing that action into energetics. So take the expectorant action, right? We have stimulant expectorants, we have relaxant expectorants, we have demulcent expectorants, right? So we got those that are warm and dry, we got those that are cool and moist, and we've got those that are relaxant, dilating, opening, antispasmodic, right? And so what happens to that huge list of herbs when you divide it into the energetics with the action? It gets much more specific, right? So all of a sudden you've got, instead of all those herbs lumped together in one general category, you can divide that category into 3 very specific ones, where in the demulcent expectorants you've got your coltsfoot, your plantain, your licorice, your marshmallow, your slippery elm. In your stimulant expectorants you got your osha, elecampane, lomatium, right? And in your relaxant expectorants, right, you got things like skunk cabbage and lobelia and ephedra and things like that, right? So all of a sudden you have this key that allows you to match the specific type of herb to the specific state of the tissue that's imbalanced. Does that make sense? Y'all see how that can be really useful, right? It gets us more specific, and that's what I'm all about in herbal medicine, right, is getting really specific, right, into like, what is this medicine doing, right? Like, how is it functioning on a physiological level, as well as on this more energetic level? Okay. Okay. So the energetics of the herb adjusts the state of the tissue. It adjusts the state of the tissue, whereas the action adjusts a physiological process. So expectorants, it facilitates in the removal of mucus from the respiratory system, right? Diuretic, a lot of people think diuretic just makes you pee more, but a diuretic really is purging fluids from tissues. Right? That's why you take a diuretic for like a puffy, swollen, inflamed arthritic joint, right? And the swelling goes down, the pain and pressure goes down. It's not just making you pee more, it's actually drying out that tissue, right? Through kind of like squeezing the water out of it, right? So it's a physiological process, right? And it's important to understand that, because some actions, just by the nature of that action, we can see the energetics, right? A diuretic, what type of energy is a diuretic going to have? It's drying, right? Making you pee more, right? You're losing more fluids, right? So it's pretty much like 95% of diuretics tend to be drying, right? Most bitters tend to be drying. They're increasing secretions that are ultimately leaving your body, and that's going to, over a longer term period of time, dry you out, right? So this is again, very, very important, and really gets us a lot more specific. Okay, so as I mentioned, this polarity of energetics and constitution worldwide, cross-culturally, all systems have some sort of model that addresses these 2 facets of people and plants, and it's really after kind of the downfall in terms of our Western systems of the eclectic system and the physiomedicalist, as our more modern pharmaceutical biomedical model became more in favor, that these kind of dropped out of the picture, right? And we started to focus more on single isolated constituents and pharmacology and biochemistry, right? And we kind of forgot about the energetics, right? And so I feel like this is a really important dynamic that it's critical to bring back into our model of herbal medicine, and a lot of people are talking about it more, right? And just based on your responses to the questions that I postulated, it's like I can see that it's, becoming more and more recognized and understood, and that makes me happy. That's really, really good, because we can't treat a plant like a drug, right? We can't. It doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. I remember There was something Paul Bergner said one time that really struck me, and I find myself saying that a lot. He says a lot of things that strike me as very profound, right? And he said to have a practice of herbal medicine that's only focuses on the pharmacology of a plant effectively cripples you as a clinician. It's like, wow, that's a really powerful statement, isn't it? Right? And that's what our whole, for the most part, like the whole natural products industry focuses on, right? Standardized extracts, and all the studies are on single molecules, and they say this does that, right? And it doesn't work, right? And it cuts the root of holistic medicine, right? It cuts it at the root. So I'm really passionate about this subject, as I'm sure you can gather. Okay. Any questions so far? Am I making sense? Okay. Anybody have any questions before I move into the next layer? Okay. So let's talk about our map here, our key. Now I have really bad handwriting, so I think faster than I can write. So what I would like to share with you here is a teaching from the Western alchemical tradition. For those of you not familiar with my work, I'm very integrated into the Western alchemical tradition and kind of their cosmology, their understanding of life and of nature, and how, they say alchemy is the universal science, the universal medicine, and the universal spirituality. So it ties a lot of things together. And I remember when I first was introduced to this map that I'm going to show you here, I was like, wow, that's really profound, because that literally brings together all of these different systems that I had been studying prior to learning alchemy. And so I know in the class description I didn't say I was going to teach you anything about alchemy, but I wanted to weave this in because this for me was what really was like, oh, all of these systems are talking about the exact same thing, right? They're just using different words. Because whether you're in the far east or the far west or the far north or the far south, we're all on the same Mother Earth, right? It's the same water, it's the same earth, it's the same air, it's the same fire. They all saw the light of nature. They all perceived the intelligence of life, the wisdom, right, of creation within all things. And because they were all following that light of nature, they all saw the same pattern, the same blueprint, the same map. Right? But based on their culture and their ecosystem, right, they all had different ways of expressing it, right? So I wanted to share this kind of cosmology with you. And this is one thing I'm also really passionate about, is, one thing that I've noticed in my study of Western herbalism in particular, especially like a lot of the books that are out there, is that I noticed that okay, so it's like if you pick up a book on Ayurvedic medicine or Chinese medicine or kind of some of the more Eastern systems of medicine, kind of like the first little parts of those books tend to be, they're not talking about herbs so much right off the bat, right? They tend to talk more about creation, right? Life. They're talking about like, what is life? What is nature? What is how is all of this stuff put together, right? Like, what's the foundation of life itself? How is form created, right? And there's kind of, and in that way, and I think that's why a lot of people are drawn to more Eastern systems of medicine, because they seem to have a little bit more of a spiritual connection. Y'all know what I'm talking about, right? There's a metaphysical pattern behind their system of medicine, right? Does that make sense? I think in Western herbalism, I haven't really felt that so strongly in a lot of the texts that I've read. Anybody else feel that way? Right? It's like you open a Western herbal book and they're like, all right, let's talk pharmacology, or here's the herbal actions, or okay, here's, use this herb for that, or and I've always been like, man, it's like I can't put my finger on it, but it feels like something's missing here. Anybody else ever feel that way? Yeah. That really bothered me for a really long time. And that was ultimately what got me into Ayurveda, right? First Ayurvedic book, Yoga of Herbs, right? First chapter in that book, you know what that first chapter is called? The manifestation of consciousness into plants. And I was like, I mean, it gives me shivers right now. And I'm just like, what? And those like 5-6 pages totally changed my whole reality. And I've read those first 5 pages probably 50 times, and every time I'm reading it, I'm just like, this is so profound, like, this is amazing, like why don't any Western herbal books talk about this stuff, right? Where's the spirit behind the medicine? Right? And I think that's a lot of us here are really probably trying to bring that back in. How many of y'all are trying to bring that spirit back into your practice of herbal medicine? Yeah, it's so needed, especially in our Western culture, right? And so the reason for that, right? The reason for that is because what we see in the history of the Western world is a gradual desacralization of the sacred sciences, right? That for a very long time there was the esoteric traditions, the mystery schools, right? The mystery teachings that was really our Western system of metaphysics, right? That really goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, right? And is the foundation of, mystical Judaism, Christianity, right? But what we see is, as the scientific mind has become more dominant, that these sacred sciences just turned into sciences. Alchemy turns into chemistry. Astrology turns into astronomy. Herbal medicine turns into pharmaceutical drugs. You see that? How you kind of have... And what's the difference between alchemy and chemistry and astrology and astronomy? There's meaning, right? The first ones, there's a meaning. An alchemist looks at a chemical and says there's a meaning there. There's an intelligence there. There's a spirit in that molecule, in that substance that's alive. There's life there, and we can learn from that. Whereas the chemist just is like, well, what's its molecular weight and how many electrons are spinning around it, and right? Which is great, it's cool, but it's not the whole picture. The astrologer looks up into the sky and sees a planet and sees that planet is an intelligence, that it's impacting us, that we're actually connected to that, and that we can learn from that. There's a meaning there. Whereas the astronomer just wants to calculate its orbital rate and what kind of chemical composition it has, and if there's water there, and right? So there's a meaning there. And I'm really passionate about this. I know I'm kind of digressing a little bit, but I'm kind of setting the stage here because I believe that Western herbalism has become disconnected from its metaphysical roots. And that metaphysical root really is these more esoteric teachings of alchemy and astrology and kind of what in the Hermetic system they call the yoga of the West. Right, the yoga of the West, our mystery teachings, right? And they were mystery teachings, like in the sense that they had to be kind of kept underground, right? Because if you practiced that and people became aware of it, you were killed, right? Because it was because it's about your direct connection to Source, to God, to the Creator, right? And that sometimes got in the way of the religions, right? So, and I'm not, hopefully that statement doesn't offend anyone, but I'm sure y'all know what I'm talking about. Yeah, okay. So to me, the reclamation of alchemy and medical astrology in our system of Western herbalism reclaims its metaphysical roots. It reclaims its metaphysical roots. It connects our system of herbal medicine to the greater pattern of life. And this greater pattern of life is the same exact pattern they talk about in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and these other systems, right? So I kind of want to share with you that map here because that is the key to herbal energetics and constitutions, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about. So, okay. So that was a long intro there. Okay, so in the beginning, And I'm going to kind of move through this a little quickly so I can get to the point. But it all begins with a point. And I say that is like the formless form, right? The void, it's kind of that first point of creation that's beyond time, it's beyond space. It's everythingness that contains nothing. It's nothingness that contains everything. It's beyond all duality. So anytime we say one thing about it, we have to say the opposite thing about it. So they say, in alchemy, they call this the prima materia. The first matter that is not matter. Right? So, and it's kind of like impossible to like think about because it's beyond our rationality, right? It's beyond our ability to understand it. It's like, I remember, it makes me think of like when I was a kid, I used to do this thing. And it's funny, like looking back on it, I'm like, wow, that's actually kind of profound. But I used to close my eyes and I would like go, in my mind, I would kind of like go way out into space. And I was like, well, what if there was like no stars and nothing, if there was like nothing there, what would there be? Or like, what was there before there was all of this? And it was like, and I'd be like, ah, and I'd kind of freak out and be like, oh, you know, like, whoa, like, what just happened, you know? And I was like, oh, but I really want to understand that, right? And it was kind of that, you know? It was like, well, what would there be if there was no space? It's like if you try to think about that, you'll go crazy, right? Right? And that's really what this is what was there before time, before space, right? A lot of people call this God, right? Okay, so they say in the beginning that first that prima materia, that nothingness that contains all things, it divided, right? It is that first pulse of creation, right? In science, what they call it the Big Bang. Right, the pulse, that life emerged, right? And they say it divided into two components. What in alchemy they call celestial niter and celestial salt. And this established the initial polarity of creation, right? The division, the duality. And so that celestial niter, and I'll kind of go through chains of correspondence, right? And maybe use some different terms to talk about the different components that I'm going to put up on the board here. So probably some of those you'll know some of them, right? So, so you know, one of my favorite reflections of that duality is our Chinese model of Yang and Yin, right? In the Kabbalah, they say this is force, and this is form. Day and night, right? Masculine quality, feminine quality, right? Energy and structure, right? All polarity, right? So we live in a dualistic world, right? And one of the qualities of the polarity that I really like from the alchemical perspective is what they call the volatile path and the fixed path. And that's everything in alchemy is taking a fixed substance and volatilizing it into the ethers, and then taking a volatile substance and fixing it back down into the earth. And that's they create circulations, right? Moving something from the earth up into the heavens, and from the heavens back into the earth. And in that way, you're circulating the soul and the spirit and the body of a form through the cosmos. And that's why in alchemy, one of the classic symbols is the Ouroboros, right? The snake eating its own tail, because it's that cycle of regeneration, of birth, death, and rebirth, right? So, so lots of different polarities, right? We could go on and on, but I want to get to the point. So from here, these two, and I kind of like to describe this as like the mitosis of creation, right? The mitosis, the division of life. And so each of these components further divide into 4 components here. Any guesses on what those 4 things might be? What's a fourfold pattern? The elements, right? The elements. And so we see celestial niter divides into what they call the two volatile elements of alchemy, right? What we call fire and air. And note, these are the traditional glyphs. So they say fire is more volatile than air. And that's why the air has that little line going across it, because it's a little more fixed. And then celestial salt divides into what they call the two fixed elements, water and earth. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the elements here in a moment. The next layer of our, well, let's talk about the elements for a minute now, actually. So, I mean, the elements, right? They're like probably one of the most universal patterns that you see cross-culturally. Medical systems, spiritual traditions, folk traditions, they all recognize the potency and the power of the elements, right? The four cardinal directions, the four seasons, lots of different ways that that pattern manifests. Yeah, actually in a little bit, I'll take this pattern and show how it applies to constitutions and energetics. But for now, I'll just kind of give you the map. The next layer of this cosmology is actually a recombination of these different qualities. So we see these elemental forms, and this is based on the Western system, right? So it's a little bit different from, like, for example, the Ayurvedic system, right? It's a little bit different, right? But when you really like break it down and look at what they're talking about, it's the exact same thing, okay? So in alchemy, they say that earth and water come together to form what is called salt. Water and air come together to form what is called mercury. And air and fire come together to form what is called sulfur. And thus we have the establishment of the Trinity, right? The Holy Trinity of life. And pretty much anywhere we look, we tend to find some form of triune pattern, right? A threefold energetic pattern in various systems, right? I mean, think of Christianity, right? We got the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? That's the three principles of Christianity, right? So what's another threefold pattern that you all think of? Come on. The doshas, right? The three doshas of Ayurveda, right? So sulfur is like the pitta dosha, mercury is like the vata dosha, and salt is like the kapha dosha. Now I know for those of you that know your Ayurveda are like, wait a minute, vata is not composed of water and air, it's composed of air and ether. So again, whenever we cross-compare cultures, we'll always find some minor little differences. But if you study mercury and you study vata, they're the exact same principles, right? It's another threefold system, threefold model. Say again? The goddess. Okay, like Mother Maiden Crone kind of thing? Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Pardon? The three treasures? Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Three treasures of Chinese medicine. Yep. We also have our three modes of astrology, right? Cardinal, mutable, fixed, right? Sulfur is like cardinal. Vata, mercury is mutable. And fixed is salt, kapha. And in general, you know, these are related to what in alchemy they say is body, spirit, and soul. And a lot of people are like, well, wait a minute, soul and spirit, aren't those the same thing, basically, right? Like we tend to use the word spirit and soul pretty interchangeably, but in the alchemical tradition, they're actually quite distinct and different. So they say the soul is your unique embodiment of the Creator. Right? It's like how the source of life uniquely manifests in you as an individual. Right? So like my soul is different from your soul, is different from your soul, is different from your soul. Like all individual beings have a uniqueness to them, right? That, like, and it's kind of profound if you think about it, like, nowhere in the whole creation of everything in the totality of life, there is nothing like you. It's kind of cool, right? That we're unique, right? That we have a unique gift, we have a unique purpose, we have our own soul that's distinct and individual, and it's our own. Whereas spirit is like the vital force, right? There's one spirit that moves through all things, that animates and imbues everything with life, right? That my spirit, the spirit that moves through me is the spirit that's moving through all of you, that's giving you life, right? It's that one spirit that moves through all things. So the soul is individual, the spirit is universal. Does that make sense? Right? I love that distinction, because they say alchemy is the middle path, right? So it doesn't get too far on the whole, we're all one, we're all interconnected, everything's, right? And it's not like, I'm an island and I'm separate from anything and I'm not connected to anything, right? But it shows both, right? Both sides of that equation. Body, of course, is the vehicle through which the soul and the spirit operate through, right? So anyways, I just wanted to draw this map for you, because this is, like, for me, the key to understanding herbal energetics and our constitutional systems. Because when we look at, especially, when we look at these different layers, we see that pretty much every tradition has some sort of representation of these energetic patterns, because that's all these are energetic patterns. And the way a lot of people talk about this blueprint is like the macrocosm, right? That this is how life was created, and they kind of think of it in this big picture thing. But one of the critical teachings of the Hermetic system is, and you all have heard this, right? As above, so below, right? That the macrocosm and the microcosm are one and the same. And so when I started thinking about that and I was kind of meditating on this map, I was like, oh, wait a minute, like, all of that's inside of me. All of that is inside every medicine. Every plant that we work with has this pattern within it, right? And it's like, I don't know, like, kind of in the more, we hear this a lot, that like, oh, the part contains the whole, that life is a hologram, that's like we live in this holographic universe, right? And, I always hear people, oh, like the whole universe is in everything, and I was like, wow, that's super profound, and it blows my mind, and that's really cool, and I have no idea what to do with that, right? Or I'm like, okay, cool, the universe is in the plant, but how? Like, what does that really mean? And what can I do with it? What can I do with that really profound understanding? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Anybody else ever feel that way? Right? Or I'm like, anytime something's really profound for me, I'm like, cool, what can I do with it? Right? How can I implement that in a practical, tangible way? Right? So that really kind of struck me when I was like, oh, well, when they say the whole universe, the whole pattern of creation is in the part, and I learned this map, I was like, oh, that's the pattern, right? That's the pattern. And we can understand people and plants through this map, right? So it's like we all have an essence. We all have an essential nature. We all have a dynamic and a magnetic nature. We all have force and we all have form, right? We all have these four elements within us. Right? We got a physical body, we've got an emotional body, we've got an intellectual body, and we've got an intuitive body, right? I forgot to mention here too that in the Western system, these four elements come together to form the ether, or the quintessence. Anybody recognize that symbol? Right? The seal of Solomon, or the Star of David, right? And what's one of the terms that is oftentimes used to describe the ether, or the fifth element? Space. Anybody familiar with the work of Nassim Haramein? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Nassim, he's a physicist, like a brilliant physicist. Y'all should check out his work. He's pretty amazing.
What's the name again?
Nassim Haramein. I don't know if I say his name right. I think that's how you spell it. But usually if you go, he's pretty popular. But what science has shown is that the geometric structure of space, like a three-dimensional version of that, is what they call a star tetrahedron. And the star tetrahedron is actually the geometric structure of space, which I think is really interesting that for thousands of years this has been the symbol for the ether, which is space, and then science just discovered that the three-dimensional form of that is actually the structure of space. I'm like, well, that's so cool. I always get really excited when science confirms something that these ancient traditions have been saying for a really long time, and they're like, well, that's not true, and they're like, oh, actually it is. You know? Like, shit. I was really hoping to prove them wrong. So, okay, so and everything contains soul, spirit, and body. What differentiates different organisms is their relative ratios of each of these forces, right? Is the relative, we all have all of this within us, but some of us maybe have a little more of some and a little less of others. That's what determines our constitution. And really, when we're looking at herbal energetics, really what we're looking at is the constitution of the plant, right? Like, think of nettles, right? Nettles has this very strong kind of volatile quality to it, right? It's sharp and it's prickly, and you touch it and it stings and it's hot and it's sharp, right? And it works through our blood, and it's working on heat and inflammation, right? And so it kind of has this like strong kind of fiery quality to it, right? Just in the way it looks, and it's got a lot of watery qualities to it as well. Nettles is a complex medicine, but, right? And so when we look at, we say, oh, this medicine has a unique composition of the elements and a unique composition of these, what in alchemy they call philosophical principles. So I'd like to kind of, and of course, you know, Chinese medicine, their whole, it's like the crux of Chinese medicine is based on this polarity, right? Yin and yang in excess or in deficiency, right? And it's like they have this entire very complex system of therapeutics and evaluation and assessment, just looking at that polarity, right? And of course, it goes in a lot more detail than that, but we can take each of these layers and go really, really far with it. So I'd like to share a little bit about how the elements, the fourfold pattern and this threefold pattern are shown up in some different systems of constitutional theory of both people and plants. Any questions so far? Am I making any sense? Okay, cool. Nods. Great. Yes. Hi.
Do you mind saying again, with earth, water, air, and fire, there was intuitive, intellect?
Yeah, that's based on Carl Jung's work. So Carl Jung has what he calls the 4 psychic functions, and it's kind of like a temperamental type. So he says you have, like, the earth element is like the sensory type person, right? They tend to like really connect and learn through senses, like touch and taste and sight and smell, and they're like very tactile kind of people. Whereas the water element is more the feeling type. Like, these are people that tend to be kind of more governed by their emotions and their feelings. Whereas the air type is more the intellectual type, right? They tend to be a little bit more in their mind and kind of, yeah, more intellectual. And the fire is what he calls like the intuitive type. Yeah. You're welcome.
And who was that
Carl Jung, yeah, who studied alchemy in a lot of depth. So, cool if I erase this? I always ask so I don't get yelled at. Done it before and they're like, no! Oh my gosh, sorry. Okay. So, Okay. So, when we're looking at constitutional systems and we observe the 4 elements, or I'm going to say 4/5 elements, because some systems work with 4, some really recognize and work with that 5th element too. We notice that it pretty much is across the board, right? So of course, one of our main elemental models in the West goes all the way back to Greek medicine, as well as the Unani Tib system, which is Arabic medicine, which was very much influenced by Egyptian medicine, right? So we have our 4 humors, right? Melancholic is the earth element, phlegmatic is the water element, sanguine is the air element, and choleric is the fire element, right? So, well, melancholic is earth, phlegmatic is air, or water, sanguine is air, and choleric is fire. Yeah. And those, of course, relate to different types of what they call bile, different humors within the. And a humor is basically like kind of a fluid in the body. So you have like black bile, red bile, yellow bile, white bile, are all connected to those elements as well. And of course, in psychotherapy, we have Carl Jung's 4 psychic functions, as I just mentioned. We have the sensory type, the feeling type, the intellectual type, or the thinking type, and the intuitive type, right? Totally based off of our 4 elements. Of course, the 5 elements are a central part of Ayurvedic medicine as well as Chinese medicine. The Chinese system, a little bit of a different take on it, but there is, I would say, more similarities than there are differences. In Ayurvedic medicine, while they do recognize the importance of the elements, I would say they primarily work with the threefold pattern in Ayurveda with the doshas, right? So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail there. One of the main systems that I really predominantly use the most these days in regards to the elements is what they call the 6 tissue states. And this is one of our North American systems of constitutional theory from the physiomedicalists, and this was, really kind of brought more into our modern era through the work of Matthew Wood. Anybody familiar with the 6 tissue states? Heard of them? Oh, not too many. Okay. This is an awesome system. And I know you're probably like, well, wait a minute, there's 4 or 5 elements. Why is there 6 tissue states? So I don't have enough time to go into a lot of detail on each of these tissue states, but just very briefly, I'd like to at least share with you the core elemental correspondences and how I tend to think of them. So we have what's called heat, excitation, cold, depression. Actually, let me start over. And this actually will apply to both plant energetics and constitutions, is that there's 3 primary layers of energetics in both people and plants that we're looking at. 3 fundamental qualities, right? And those 3 fundamental qualities are temperature, moisture, and the third is the one that a lot of people tend to overlook. That's really, really important, right? And that's tone. Tone, right? So temperature, we have 2 dynamics with temperature. We have, and of course, each of these divides in a polarity, which generates our 6 tissue states. So we have heat excitation. What's the opposite of heat? Cold depression. And I always tell people, really focus on the second word, because the second word provides a lot of insight into the nature of these tissue states. A lot of people focus on the first one. They're like, heat, oh, hot. And then they think like a thermometer, right? Like the temperature on a thermometer. We have to think it's not just like the temperature, it's the quality of that temperature. So what happens when you're really hot? you get kind of like frantic, and what direction does your energy move? Moves up, right? And it tends to be like generate energy, right? It disperses, it moves, it radiates, right? So those are the kind of qualities that are important to consider. Depression, what happens when something is and these are all kind of words that we tend to use psychologically too, right? Someone feels really excited, right? Or they feel really depressed, right? So you think depression, like think of the, like if you can right now, maybe you don't want to, but generate the feeling of depression, right? What's it feel like? It's like heavy, and it's slow, and it's lethargic, and it's tired, and it like kind of doesn't want to get out of bed, and it's just like, oh, everything sucks. Put that energy into a liver, into the colon, into the heart. You see, that feels really different than just thinking about cold. Does that make sense? Right? Like with excitation, I always say, like, think of a kid the day of their birthday. Right? They're like, oh my God, this is so exciting, look at these presents, and I got cake, and all my friends are here, and this is all bouncing balls, and all, and they're like freaking out, right? And they're really excited and stoked, and now take that energy and put it in the heart, right? And what's the heart gonna feel like when it's got that excitation in there, right? Does that make sense? Right, so the second word, really, really important to understand the qualitative dynamic of these 6 tissue states. Okay, then we have moisture. We have damp, stagnation, and dry, atrophy. And atrophy, that a lot of people aren't too familiar with the term atrophy. Atrophy basically means weak, withering, malnourished, deficient, right? So it's kind of like like a muscle that becomes atrophied. It's like if you don't use it, you lose it. Right? Like my mom had a really bad high ankle sprain, and she couldn't walk on her right leg for like 2 years. And her right leg, like her thigh was like that big around, right? Ankle, all the muscle just atrophied, right? Because it wasn't being used. So it became very weak and brittle and deficient and kind of emaciated, right? And I remember seeing that, I was like, oh, that's what an atrophied tissue looks like. And then tone, the one that's often overlooked, is what they call damp relaxation. And I know that confuses a lot of people. They're like, wait, I thought that one was damp. So water is like, well, all the elements are magical, but I think water especially is magical. Maybe it's because I have 4 planets in Pisces, but so we have water that slows and stagnates and like turns into a swamp. And then you have water that overflows, or it flows into areas it's not supposed to flow into, right? That the latter is more the relaxed tissue state, right? So, and I'll kind of give the elemental qualities of each of these, but the relaxed form of water is like the structure of the tissue is weakened, so it can't hold the water in place, right? It's like a riverbank. I always think of nature, and that's the whole thing with this, is that this is an ecological model of the body. So I'm always thinking of like, oh, damp stagnation, that's like the bog and the swamp, right? Oh, heat excitation, that's like the desert in the middle of July at noon, right? Cold depression, it's like, damp stagnation, that's like Portland, right? So, right? So I'm always thinking ecologically, because the body is a microcosm of nature. And so and that's where our plants grow. And so the more we can think of the body as an ecosystem, right? And then observe, as someone, I believe you said, the habitat of the herb, right? Where that plant grows, and looking at the ecosystem of the herb tells you a lot about how that herb impacts the ecosystem of the body, right? Isn't it interesting that aloe vera grows in the middle of a really hot, dry desert? And it's this super cooling, moistening remedy, right? Because aloe grows in the ecology that it treats in our ecology. Right? I find Devil's Club's the same way. Where does Devil's Club like to grow? The deep, dark, wet parts of the forest, right? And it's kind of pungent and warming, and treats that damp, stagnant accumulation within the body. So.
Did you share the other ecologic, like the cold depression?
Oh, well, cold depression, I tend to think of just like the cold of winter, right? Like the north, right? Dry atrophy, again, kind of the desert, anywhere there's a deficiency of water. The relaxed one I tend to think of like a riverbed, right? And like, a good example of this is on my property. We have a pond that in the winter, when the water table rises, that pond gets really, really full. As soon as the water stops coming in and starts to dry out, all the water leaks. It's like there isn't a good clay pack in the pond, and the water leaks out, and the pond drops. It'll drop 6 feet in a week because because the structure of the earth isn't enough to hold the water in. Right? The structure of the earth isn't as such that it can hold the water in. We're talking about tone, the tone of the tissue. It's too lax, right? It's like a guitar string, right? The relaxation tissue state is like that guitar string is just floppy and loose. Blah, 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 right? It doesn't make a good clear tone. The opposite of that is what they call wind tension, which is too much tone, too tight, right? So we have like good tone, we have relaxation, and then we have tension, too tight, right? So the way I see the elements here, heat excitation is excess fire, cold depression is deficiency fire, damp stagnation, excess water, dry atrophy, deficiency water, damp relaxation, I think of deficiency of the earth. And wind tension, I think of excess of air. That's just how I tend to think of it. Okay?
Those flowers.
They're really pretty, aren't they? I walked in and I got really happy. I was like, whoa, those are really pretty. And of course, this can be translated into our medical astrology as well. So heat excitation is generated by the sun and Mars. Cold depression is I'm going to move quickly because I'm running short on time. It's really hard for me to teach in an hour and a half. I'm used to having 4 days, and I can be long-winded. So Saturn generates cold depression. Damp stagnation is generated by the moon. Dry atrophy generated by Saturn. Damp stagnation is also generated by Jupiter. Damp relaxation generated by Venus. And wind tension is generated by Mercury. That's predominantly focused on our 7 inner planets and Saturn. Notice Saturn pops up a lot. Saturn tends to create hardship. But it's good because it makes you stronger. Okay, so I just wanted to take a little bit of extra time on these 6 tissue states, because a lot of people, when we think of constitutional theory, we tend to think more of like body type, right? We tend to think of more like kind of big picture constitution. I like the 6 tissue states because we're actually looking at the specific constitution of the tissue that constitutes the function and structure of an organ. Does that make sense? Right? So the constitution of the tissue that determines the state of the organ function. Right? Okay. So now in terms of plant energetics, we have our baseline dynamic, which this is pretty universal. Temperature and moisture again. So we have the hot, cold, wet, dry polarity. I can't tell you how important this information is to know about every single remedy. Yes, every single remedy that you work with. You have to know it, right? And this isn't referenced in a whole lot of books that much. There are some books that reference hot, cold, wet, dry properties. I encourage you to experience it for yourself, right? So when you're working with Oregon grapefruit, drink a quart of the decoction a day, and take maybe 5 milliliters of the tincture 3 times a day, then maybe try taking a drop of the tincture 3 times a day. I always encourage my students to experiment with the effects of an herb in a very low dose as well as a very high dose, so you know how that medicine works, right? So that when you give it to someone, you can understand the spectrum of that dosage range, and you can see what they need, right? But the only way you really learn that is through your own body, through your own tactile experience, right? So that, again, we're not just armchair herbalists, right? That we're experiential herbalists. Differentiation of our herbs into hot, cold, wet, dry, again, gets us much more specific into selecting the right remedy for the person. It also influences your formulation in a really big way, right? Because now what you're able to do is when you write out a formula, you can go through, okay, warm, 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 cold, 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 dry, 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 dry. Not a totally constitutionally balanced formula, right? Now, of course, if someone needs to be dried out, that'd be a great formula, right? But y'all see that? So, and that's why one of the big things here that's really, really critical is this one right here. Dry. Because I would say probably 90% of herbal medicines are drying. Right? Make you pee more, make you sweat more, make you poop more, make it, right? That's just like make things leave your system, right? Most herbs tend to be drying, right? And so knowing your moistening remedies is really, really important. This is why licorice is probably one of the most widely used herbs in Chinese medicine, right? And they say it's a harmonizer. And I always thought about that. I was like, a harmonizer, and the way I was really taught, they're like, yeah, it tastes good. It harmonizes the formula. It makes a really nasty tasting decoction taste a little bit better. And I'm like, yeah, I see that, but there's got to be something more to it. And then when I looked into the energetic qualities, I was like, licorice is moist. Most of these herbs are drying.
It's also warming, isn't it? Licorice?
No, it's more on the cooling side.
Is it?
Yeah, very slightly cooling. Yeah.
I've racked my brain to think of things that are both moistening and warming.
Yeah, very limited herbs. One of my favorite warming and moistening herbs is cinnamon. Cinnamon is a great warming demulcent. Yeah, but there's not very many of them. Again, those are the best remedies for the Vata constitution. Because that's the tricky thing with balancing Vata, is that they're cold and dry. So you want to warm them up, but as soon as you start warming them up too much, then you start drying them out. And you want to moisten them up, but you give them too many moistening things, and then they start to feel kind of cold, right? And so, again, they're constantly changing, right? So it makes it a little bit difficult. So knowing your moistening materia medica is really, really important. And I think, Michael Tierra says that we live in a yin deficient culture. That yin deficiency is an underlying pattern, and i.e. yin deficiency basically means dry atrophy. If someone has yin deficiency, then it's really difficult for your medicines to work, right? Because yin is what absorbs things.
What author was that?
Michael Tierra, yeah. And he says, yin deficiency is one of the most critical patterns that Western herbalists need to learn how to see and recognize, right? So knowing your moistening materia medica, very important. What are some of our good moistening remedies? Althea, marshmallow, right? Licorice. One of my favorites these days is Solomon's seal, right? Cinnamon's moistening, right? Milky oats. Really good demulcent for the nerves. Pretty unique in that way, for sure.
Slippery elm?
Slippery elm, absolutely demulcent. Yep. Plantain, demulcent. Comfrey, demulcent, right? So, moistening remedies there. Another one that I've been really liking lately is corn silk. Because we've been shucking a lot of corn back home and drying all the corn silk. I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting medicine. The corn silk, it's got some very distinct signatures on it. That's been kind of a cool remedy coming to mind. Not to mention just corn being such a sacred plant. I mean, you really look at corn, it's like, that's a really interesting looking plant. It's like, whoa, it kind of blows my mind. So anyways, moving on. I only got 15 minutes left, so I want to try to cover our 3 principles a little bit. Any questions on the elements? There's a lot more that we could go into here, right? I mean, just on the elements, I usually talk for 3 days just on the elements, right? So this is like super Cliff Note version. But I just wanted to mention these 3 dynamics. And again, the thing with constitutional theory is that it translates between physiology and psychology. It translates between physiology and psychology. And so you start to see how the physiological expression could be a predominance of a psychological dynamic, but the psychological dynamic could potentially be caused from the physiological dynamic, right? We tend to think, oh, all problems in the body are caused by the spirit. It's not always true, right? That problems that we have in our emotional and psychological layers could potentially be because of a physiological imbalance. That's something I'm really adamant about sharing, right? Does that make sense? How many of y'all agree with me on that? Awesome, yay. Okay, so 3 principles. We of course have our 3 doshas of Ayurveda, as well as our 3 gunas of Ayurveda. Doshas, vata, pitta, kapha. Gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas. Right? Very critical understanding. I love the doshas. I think it's an amazing pattern, and it just makes sense. It makes so much sense to me personally. It's not for everyone, but I really love, I just love Ayurveda because it's not a medical system, it's a system of life and how to live every day in a holistic way, so that the way we live every day is harmonizing us with life. So I think it's really profound. We also have, in our Western system, we have what are a man named Sheldon. I'll just say Sheldon's Constitutions. Any of you heard of Sheldon before? What he calls ectomorph, endomorph, and mesomorph. Those are the 3 doshas, right? And I'm pretty sure he wasn't super familiar with the 3 doshas of Ayurveda, but he came up with the exact same thing. And to me, that's like a double-blind, placebo-controlled study. Right? I mean, if someone way across the world and they come to the exact same conclusions, but they weren't, it's like, well, they tapped into some universal truth of life, right? So I really get excited when I see things like that. I'm like, whoa, cool. And you know what another really great example of that is, actually? I'm going to digress for a moment because this is really fascinating to me. So in Ayurvedic medicine, they have what they call Agni Amma theory. Anybody familiar with Agni Amma? So they say Agni is a metabolic fire. They tend to say, most people tend to say digestive fire. I think metabolic fire is a much better term because Agni isn't just in the gut, it's within every cell. And it's the ability to process, transform, absorb nutrients, and expel waste products to be eliminated from the body. And when that Agni becomes deficient, Amma accumulates, which is basically toxins, right? Amma is basically damp stagnation, right? Now, how many of y'all have heard of Samuel Thompson? Samuel Thompson, he was kind of like one of the main figureheads of North American herbal medicine, right? And he integrated folk traditions, you know, a lot of the wisdom of the First Nations people here, and kind of put it together into a system, right? It was one of the first systems in North American medicine. And Samuel Thompson had this theory that he called the fountain of life. And he said, the fountain of life is in the solar plexus, we have a certain fire. And that fire radiates and distributes heat throughout the organism. And when that fire becomes deficient, canker forms. And canker is like this thick, sticky, congealed substance that clogs the channels of the body and creates sickness. And I remember reading that and I was like, that's Agni Amma theory. It's the same exact thing. You got Samuel Thompson and like, I'm not very good with dates, so I don't remember when Samuel Thompson did anything. It was like 1700s or something, right? It's like the same exact theory of Ayurveda, and he wasn't aware of Ayurvedic medicine, right? So when I see things like that, I'm like, that's truth. There's something there. So, and then of course we have our 3 modes of astrology. cardinal, mutable, and fixed. A lot of people don't tend to think of those as constitutions, but they are, right? So, we have our cardinal signs, our mutable signs, and our fixed signs. I don't have time to get into all of that into detail, but that's another way that we can work with constitutions. If you're interested in astrology and constitutional dynamics, the really good book on that called The Astrological Body Types by one of for those of you from Portland here, a great local medical astrologer, Judith Hill. Are y'all familiar with the Renaissance Medicine Conference that goes on here in Portland that Judith Hill puts on? You gotta check it out. Renaissance Medicine Conference is happening, I think it's the 4th year, happening next year here in Portland. Awesome. If you're interested in medical astrology and alchemy and herbalism, you gotta go to that conference because that's what it's all about. Okay. Lastly here, the way the 3 principles manifest in our herbal energetics. This was a key thing for me, because we tend to think of plant energetics as hot, cold, wet, dry, but we've got a 3-fold model that we see. The physiomedicalists, they said, really all we do with our medicines are 3 things. And I'm such a geek for this, because anytime I see the number 3, I'm like, ooh, how does it fit into the pattern, right? And so I remember reading, we only do 3 things with our medicines. We stimulate, we relax, and we tonify, right? Now, a lot of people think stimulant and relaxant are opposites to one another. Right? Because you think like, oh, we drink coffee to be stimulated and drink wine to be relaxed, right? And they're kind of like opposites to one another, but it's really relaxant and tonic are in opposition to one another, because again, it's looking at tissue tone. It's looking at tissue tone. So with a relaxant, you're relaxing a tissue that's hypertonic, right? With a tonic, and by tonic, tonic, it's one of those really loose words in herbal medicine that's like, what does that really mean? Right? Anybody else ever feel that way about the word tonic, right? Not only 2? Oh, okay. I was like, am I the only one? Because tonic, well, what's the root of the word tonic? Tone, right? Tone. So I think I tend to combine the words tonic astringent. Very different from the way when we're looking at like Chinese herbalism, they say it's like a tonic herb. So that's kind of like more like an adaptogen, which I really don't like that word anymore. But it's a little bit different. And in Western herbalism, they usually say tonic is like a nutritive, right? Something that's really full of minerals. But I looked at a lot of those nutritive tonics, and guess what? Most of them are astringent. Red raspberry, nettles, horsetail, etc. All those alfalfa, all astringent plants. So a tonic is going to tighten and tonify a tissue. A relaxant is antispasmodic and loosens and relaxes tissue. And then a stimulant is going to activate a tissue. And now what's really important is that these 3 qualities exist outside of temperature and moisture. And one of the first things people think about stimulants is, what do you think? Warm. Right? We're like, oh, stimulant like cayenne, rosemary, prickly ash, right? But we have cooling stimulants too. A great example of a cooling stimulant is echinacea. Right? It's a stimulant, but it has a net cooling effect. Right? So stimulant, relaxant, tonic. These are, to me, the 7 critical energetic herbal actions. Right, that we have to understand, because that's going to inform us how that medicine is going to influence the constitution of the tissues. Right? Does that all make sense? Any questions? Okay, I've got like 5 minutes left. It's not nearly enough time, but I'd love to maybe go through, let's see. Okay, I talked about all of that earlier. So I'd like to mention very briefly some constitutional dynamics, what I think are important things to look at. Cool if I erase it? Nope, okay, yep. So that's okay. So constitutional dynamics, an important concept in constitutional theory is that we actually have 2. In Ayurveda, they call it You're cool? I'm doing it. Is in Ayurveda what they call Prakruti and Vikruti. Are you familiar with those terms? Yeah, so Prakruti means your great nature. And this is what they call the innate constitution. It's what you're born into and it never changes. It's like the core of the onion. It's kind of what we're all trying to get back to. Vikruti is what they call the assumed constitution. That's your current constitutional state based on what you eat, how you think, where you live, your activities, everything that you're doing, right, is influencing your, so it's like the layers that are put on top of the core of the onion.
Is Prakriti kind of like homeostasis?
I would say it's like your essential nature.
Okay.
It's like your core nature. I'm not really a big fan of the term homeostasis because it has the word stasis, which kind of means static. I think a better term is homeodynamis because it's dynamic. Balance is dynamic. We can reach a state of balance and then a breeze blows and then we're off balance again, right? And so I think homeodynamis is a good word because it's like we're constantly having to assess the external and how it influences the internal and then adjust how we think, how we live, how we feel, what we eat, etc. in order to maintain that dynamic state of balance. So Vikruti, Prakruti, innate and assumed constitution is a really important dynamic. This is usually what we're always working with in order to alleviate excesses and deficiencies so that we can get back to that. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that really quickly. As far as assessing constitution, as a lot of you mentioned, assessing the body shape and the structure of the body, and that can be the whole body, right? Tall, short, thin, thick, medium, etc. To really specific things like what's the nature of the eyebrows and the earlobes and the eyelashes and the fingers, right? Are the fingers kind of short and thick, or are they long and thin and you kind of the knuckles kind of pop out a little bit, right? And I look at Pisces, I kind of look at feet a lot, right? It's kind of weird, but you can learn a lot about someone's constitution by the feet, by the hands, the eyes, the hair. Is it curly? Is it thin? Is it thick? Is it dark and full? Or is it kind of thin and falling out? Or what's the nature of the whole body? So don't just do this when someone's in front of you asking for help, right? This turns into a mode of perception. I got my constitutional goggles on all the time. Right? Because I'm a geek for this, because I realize that this is a critical skill that is necessary for me to be a good herbalist. And so I need to develop daily habits in order to get good at it. I want to be really good at constitutional assessment. So I'm doing it all the time. I'm like at the co-op buying some kale and I'm like looking at the checkout person, not weird, but I'm like just observing. I'm listening to the tone of their voice. I'm looking at how, I'm observing, right? So I encourage you to cultivate that mode of perception. Emotional and thought patterns, right? Very important for constitutional and temperamental assessment. Symptomatic predispositions. This is where I think it's really important because based on someone's constitution, that makes them prone to specific organ system weaknesses. They makes them more prone to certain types of disease so that we can modify their lifestyle, their diet, and work with herbs to prevent that disease from ever manifesting, right? Which I think is the goal, right? I mean, I think it'd be great if we shifted our medical model so that we were paid to keep people healthy, right? And then we treat them for free when they're sick. So that how we support ourselves is based on health and not disease. Yes. Kind of cool, right? Yeah, I think that would be pretty revolutionary. So I know I kind of had to go really, really fast there. Thank you all very much for coming to my talk this morning. This is a universal language. I just want to share one last little thing. This is a universal language of nature. And so I believe the more we can connect to this language of nature and see how that language is a part of who we are and who the plants are, we're more connected to the forces of life. And I think that makes us better clinicians. I think it makes us better people. And I think it enables us to have our medicines reach a little bit deeper and provide that healing that a lot of us are wanting to provide for our people. So thank you all very much for coming this morning. I really appreciate it.